Alright, let's cut to the chase. Grinding Gear Games has an unhealthy obsession with Diablo 2. Or perhaps just Chris Wilson does. It's kind of hard to tell where the line between his opinion and the rest of GGG starts and finishes, since he's the only one who talks on their behalf. It would be interesting to see the perspective of the actual everyday designers, but that's another topic altogether. Throughout the podcast and interviews that Chris Wilson has been a guest on in the past few weeks, one resounding little quip keeps coming back. And no, it's not the hard mode diversions. Rather, it's Chris routinely using Diablo 2 as a reference from which GGG's own design decisions are being informed by. From my perspective, Chris basically says, yeah, but you play Diablo, right? And presents a clear and obvious bias towards Diablo 2 and the systems that game introduced to us. There are several problems with these comparisons. The first is that not every Path of Exile player has played Diablo 2, and assuming they have is terribly naive. Diablo 2 is a 20-year-old game. There are many PoE players who not only have never played the game in their life, but have possibly been born well after it was ever released. Using something as an analogy or reference requires your audience can actually relate to it, but if they have never played Diablo 2, then some of these analogies are lost on them entirely. Secondly, while I certainly liked Diablo 2, it is a 20-year-old game. The game industry in general has evolved significantly since then, and there are some aspects of Diablo 2 I really wouldn't want to go back to, such as having to repeat the story 3 times over, or remembering that running in combat destroys my defenses, or the fact that so many skills in the game are balanced so poorly that a class could spend up to 20 levels or more in a subpar state unless you wanted to waste points, and Diablo 2 wouldn't get any kind of respec system for 10 years after its release date. Whenever Chris or someone else brings up Diablo 2 as a reference, I am immediately reminded of all the World of Warcraft fans who wanted to go back to pre-expansion vanilla. As people would pine for this caricature, this romanticized version of a game they remembered fondly from their childhood and wanted to go back to, but they'd conveniently forgot all the boring bits because, well, that's what nostalgia does. People have misremembered so much of what really made Vanilla WoW great, most of it boiling down to the fact that we were all 14 to 20 years old, had the time to spare, and there was literally nothing like it at the time. It's like remembering how excited you were at having your first kiss, while completely ignoring all the awkwardness and embarrassment as well, and even if you do, you can't go back. You can't experience something for the first time again while also retaining all the memories that make it stand out. People conveniently forgot or simply ignored how awful class balance was, for instance. While you technically had the freedom to play whatever you wanted, the developers quite clearly pushed your class in a very particular direction, and going against that gimped you and the rest of your team quite harshly. A non-holy paladin was certainly possible, but instead of being some half-assed healer DPS hybrid that wouldn't really kick off until the end of Burning Crusade anyway, why wouldn't you just play a warrior? Vanilla WoW was, for the most part, incredibly grindy. The journey to get to 60 was arguably a bigger part for many players than actually being at 60 in rating was, which was another challenge in and of itself, since that meant having to find 39 other people by hand, and then having the patience to actually manage such a clusterfuck. I don't think any of this is bad, by the way, but they're products of their time, and times change. It's not that some people wouldn't genuinely enjoy a trip back through memory lane, but they're not usually the ones pining for a misrepresented memory of it. People who want to play Diablo 2 are already playing Diablo 2, and people who wanted to play vanilla could have played a private server for over a decade until Blizzard decided to add their own, of which they likely moved to and didn't feel compelled to convince other people why it's so great. When Chris brings up Diablo 2, it's like he conveniently ignores how much the gaming industry has changed in the 20 years it's been since the game was first released. He seems genuinely shocked at the idea that people have shorter attention spans nowadays, as if the rise of social media and the bombardment of online advertising hasn't already shown us how tiny people's focus is. MOBAs, like League of Legends, were one of the first online genres to really embrace the idea of quick and snappy get-in, get-out gameplay, something you can enjoy in the hour of free time you might have after a busy day of work. Battle Royales continue that trend. Hell, in the past 5 years we've seen the rise of the roguelike, which is a genre cut from the same ancestral cloth that Diablo was, except that it's significantly faster paced, ending almost as quickly as you begin, but often allowing for the same level of character customization that Diablo had 20 years ago. The generation of people who have actually played Diablo 2 are, generally speaking, too old to dump hundreds of hours into your average Path of Exile league, something that only lasts 3 months and has an incredible amount of busybody work you have to repeat from scratch every time. These people are no longer college students that can afford to procrastinate for 8 hours a day. They have jobs, careers, partners, children, lives outside of gaming. And what? Chris thinks it's fine that these people, the people he originally marketed the game for, people who play Diablo 2, are no longer the desired audience? Yes, you can tell them to play standard, if you ignore the fact that a new league brings new content, some of which can be insanely fun and then utterly nerfed or just non-existent come next patch. Why should one miss out on all of this for a misplaced obsession with a game Path of Exile actually managed to surpass? Let's not forget that the temporary leagues are Path of Exile's first and foremost recommended way to play a new character. That is, the mode new players will likely sign up to first. Because remember, it's not just 35-year-old Diablo fans who are playing this game anymore. It is, as said earlier, people who have likely never played Diablo 2 in their life. All of this, of course, doesn't get to the root issue with this obsession, that it's very much misrepresenting how Diablo 2 actually played out when the game was relevant. Something those of us who actually remember playing Diablo 2 aren't being fooled by. And it's even worse if you watch people play the remastered version because, yeah, it basically hasn't changed all that much, as one would expect. Yes, Diablo 2 was slower. Sure, there were exceptions, such as the 200 FCR teleport, but actually achieving that required a lot more than slotting in a movement skill and popping a flask every 5 seconds. Everything was slower. The big thing that tends to make most ARPGs feel slower, on average, is the combination of less mob density, less movement skills or ways to increase movement as dramatically as you can in PoE, and overall killing your average rare or boss takes more time. Diablo 2's teleport was stupidly powerful, but required investment for any non-sorcerer class to even get it in the first place. Empty space between packs was higher, and things just took longer to kill on average, for both players and monsters. Same applies for most ARPGs, from Titan Quest to Last Epoch, with movement skills being a lot more common now, but still not as powerful as Path of Exiles generally are. For Chris and co, to return PoE to a D2 analog, we'd have to turn the dial back to 2013 because, well, that's about as close as PoE got. But people didn't like having to farm Dox or Piety over and over. People didn't like the empty space between one pack and another. People hated having to do the campaign 3 times over, perhaps more than once per league if they wanted to play more than one character. GGG agreed, but would go one step further each and every major patch, which was constantly met to great applause. Density would slowly increase league by league, new movement skills would be added, and the in-game map system becomes significantly more accessible, even if the OG Atlas was considered pretty damn grindy. At least it was better than Dox spam. It's important to note that many of the changes and additions that would contribute to the overall increase of player power were of GGG's own design. They may have been based on what they thought players wanted, but they were generally not asked for, at least not in the way presented, and not as direct. People would be a little bit more vague and ambiguous because, well, people usually are. Users are great at telling you what doesn't feel right, but aren't very good at elaborating on why or coming up with solutions. There wasn't a big uproar, as far as I can remember, demanding something like Ascendancy, for instance, an expansion that increased the overall power of players relative to the monsters by a significantly large amount at the time. Rather, most people just wanted the endgame to be more accessible and for there to be less tedious walks from one location to another. There are few people, for instance, who can genuinely say they predicted the introduction of influenced items, a patch that would fundamentally increase the bar on what a good item was and would be routinely added to as the Atlas evolved and changed with future patches. Which does bring to mind the other major difference between Diablo and Path of Exile. Item affixes. By comparison, Diablo 2 has practically none. It still has a lot, don't get me wrong, but trying to find an item worth using in Path of Exile just from drops alone is not like trying to find a needle in a haystack, because at least you know the needle is there. But back on track, to compensate for all of this added speed and power players would get, we would also see major nerfs to things like life. It would literally be cut in half. Block would have most of the related passives removed from the tree, and these changes would continue as we saw major nerfs and changes to Eldritch Battery, Val Pact, and Energy Shield, among many other things. These and most forms of power creep are the responsibility of GGG and GGG alone. They are, after all, the ones who actually deliver the code that implements these changes in the first place. At best, they can claim that's what they thought players wanted, but then the question of what their so-called vision actually is arises once again. Because if your vision is directly tied to the whims and fancies of your user base, then what are you trying to achieve by quite clearly going against them with 3.15? For Path of Exile to resemble anything remotely similar to Diablo 2 once again, GGG would need to reverse virtually every single patch since Ascendancy came out. Chris keeps mentioning hard mode like that'll change anything, but it won't, because Path of Exile has surpassed the scope and reach that Diablo 2 once had. You can't simply change a few settings in an INI file and hope that'll all be better. The game is fundamentally different at this point, which is great. Chris and his peers spent over 10 years to create a real successor to Diablo 2, and since at least 2016, the game has walked out of Diablo's shadow and become something of its own. This is amazing! This is absolutely a good thing! Path of Exile was not successful because it was Diablo 2.5, it was successful because it was Path of fucking Exile! It deigned to be similar and inspired by, yes, but still different enough to stand on its own, and it seems increasingly likely that GGG has either lost sight of this or simply never really understood why the game blew up to begin with. As usual, my name is MrTastix. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.